You had a real Buddhist experience. Was it a meditative experience, or was it an intellectual appreciation of the truth of Buddhism?
It was certainly more than an intellectual appreciation. Yes. It was more of the nature of what we would call insight.
Yes.
Spiritual insight, with a capital I, as it were. And that did remain with me for a very long time. In fact, I could say perhaps it's remained with me ever since and has been gradually deepening.
Adhisthana is a Buddhist temple, retreat centre, and Sangharakshita's last home. On the evening of his 93rd birthday, he sat with Paramartha, a friend of 30 years. One of Sangharakshita's literary heroes made friendship an integral part of his life.
Samuel Johnson greatly enjoyed the company of his friends, and he had many very good friends. He really did cherish his friendships. He really did keep his friendships in good repair. He'd take a lot of trouble for his friends, would help them in any way he could, and also was very generous, and was very, very fond of his friends, and didn't hesitate to show it.
Who am I? I'm as much a mystery to myself as I probably am to you. Quite a lot of people know exactly who and what I am, but they see me in different ways. This was very much the case when I lived in India. A Russian spy, an American agent. More recently here in England, I have been a good monk. A bad monk, a first-class organizer, a controversial figure, and an enlightened Englishman.
My life has been to me a source of very deep satisfaction, and I feel it's normal in the best sense of the term, inasmuch as my whole life has been dedicated, as far as I'm able to dedicate it, to the realization of higher spiritual values. To me, nothing could be more normal than that. But anyway, he was trying to force temple entry for the untouchables in one of the big temples of Benares.
The Buddhist counterpart of the Vicar of Hampstead. The author of the survey. A crypto-Vajrayanist.
Were you brought up a Christian?
Yes and no, like so many other
yes.
people. I wasn't made to go to church.
I was born and brought up in southwest London, not far from Tooting Broadway. My father being of East Anglian stock and my mother partly Hungarian. My father's stepfather, who was of Portuguese origin, was a great traveller and collector of curios. From the age of 8, I was confined to bed for several years and was unable to go to school. Consequently, I grew up largely self-educated, my main interests being the classics of Western literature, both ancient and modern, and painting.
30 years after Karen Armstrong's television programme, Sangharakshita listened to an audiobook version of her scholarly account of Christianity's treatment of women.
This book will examine the way that men regarded women in Western Christianity and the ways that they coped with their view of women. It will also look at the solutions that women found for the problems that were created for them by the particular neuroses of Christianity. The idea of neurosis is important. Just as in our own personal lives, our emotions often bear little resemblance to the beliefs and opinions we hold intellectually. Thus, the Crusades, when Christians savagely butchered Muslims and Jews, completely contradicted Christianity's doctrine of love. Christian attitudes to sex and to women are similarly irrational and inconsistent, and have from time to time exploded violently. They continue to explode.
My body, my choice! My body, my choice! My body, my choice! My body, my choice! My body, my choice!
The female body was regarded with especial disgust, and it was a source of deep embarrassment to the fathers that Jesus was born of a woman. To embrace a woman, wrote Odo of Cluny in the 12th century, is to embrace a sack of manure. The messy and mysterious innards of woman with her voracious womb was particularly filthy, and the fathers wanted to make sure that Jesus had as little contact with this repulsive body as possible.
By the time I got into the ordination process and started doing the refuge tree practice, particularly the stage in the practice where you imagine your mother and father and the rest of humanity, I had a very, very strong sense that what I was doing wasn't just for me, and that actually there was a lot of work needed to heal ancestral wounds, actually. So, the pain of my parents and the generation before that and the generation before that, and that actually in my very body I carry those wounds and that pain. And that I can't, how can any one manifestation of a lifetime hold all of that? So there was a connection between having all of that behind me or on my shoulders, as it were, you could say, the weight of that, then balanced with going outward and forward towards something much bigger than oneself, and that only in connecting with that larger energy can one really be able to do that level of healing and that level of work. The first time I met with Bhante, which I always appreciate, it felt like a really, really strong teaching for me. So we were talking about Padmasambhava, and we were particularly talking about the alchemical process. So this whole kind of part of the myth of Padmasambhava being an alchemist or a magician and transforming base metals into gold. And we were talking about anger, because anger's always been one of the mental states that I both struggle with and also think of as a great gift. I said, I know, we need to bring awareness to our anger, but then what do we do with it? How do we actually transform it? And he just looked at me very, very directly. He really kind of looked right into my eyes, like that way that I think I've heard other people describe that he can look at you sometimes. And he just said, you just bring awareness to it. And then I quite arrogantly said, I know, you just bring awareness to it. But then what do you do? And he looked at me and he said, you just bring awareness to it. And I could hear the question kind of ringing in the back of his mind, which was like, do you actually have confidence that awareness is enough? And I had to really take that on board, because I think up until that point I hadn't had confidence that awareness was enough.
When he was in Kausali, Indian Independence Day, he's standing up high, bearded then, so he was already in the time of sort of being a bit of a wandering ascetic in a way. And he's standing addressing the Indian crowds. It's quite striking. He was not quite 22.
Days after Indian Independence Day, Satyapriya and Dharmapriya gave away their possessions and with shaved heads went forth into the homeless life. On reaching the south, most of their time was spent meditating and studying in the jungle vihara. On visits to the town, a vihara patron, a Brahmin, spoke what others only thought.
On one of our first visits, we had remarked how great an injustice it was that untouchables were not even allowed to use the road that led past the temples of Shiva and Ganesh. To our astonishment, Venkateshwara Iyer not only bluntly disagreed with us, but stoutly upheld that untouchables were untouchables and should be treated as such. The caste system was good, being in fact a sublime, God-given institution, and it was of the aboriginal essence of Hinduism. This was too much for Satyapriya, who at once leapt into the fray.
And the friend who was staying with me was writing his memoirs, and one day he suggested that I wrote mine. And I said, well, I haven't led a very interesting life, who would want to read about it? But he persisted, and I started writing, and it carried on.
The friend with an interesting past was Jivaka, a transgendered ship's doctor named after the Buddha's own doctor. Though he died in 1962, he made a ghostly return during Sangharakshita's 1966 farewell tour. In the 80s, a young New Zealander came across the memoir in an Auckland hippie community and was struck by the skillful way characters were portrayed.
He's always sort of sympathetic, in a way. I think that's the thing that really impresses me, and that's what impressed me when I first came across the Thousand-Petaled Lotus, which was, apart from the photo on the front that sort of hit me in the solar plexus for some reason, that was my contact with the FWBO.
After their ordination at Kushanara, Buddha-Rakshita moved to Sri Lanka. He returned to India and established the Bangalore branch of the Maha Bodhi Society.
If you want to cultivate self-mastery, know yourself.
Some of our discussions could be regarded as a bit stormy, though I had to be very, very careful what I said to him, because while I wanted to make my point, I didn't want to spark off one of his rages, which could be rather extreme. But yeah, I appreciated him very much. In fact, not so long ago, a couple of months ago, I got a message from him through a friend who'd visited him and taken his photograph. And the message was the fact that, he was now quite old, he's several years older than me, and he was preparing for death. And every day he put me in his metta. And that was the message. So I was very pleased to receive that.
That's lovely, yeah.
I had not set foot in a launderette before. To my friend, of course, such tasks as shopping and collecting one's laundry were only too familiar. And it was thanks to him that as the weeks and months went by, these and 100 other concomitants of modern living became familiar to me, or became less unfamiliar. It was Terry, more than anyone else in fact, who enabled me to make the transition to living in England. Just as 20 years previously, it had been the then Robin Banerjee who enabled me to make the transition to living in India.
There's one occasion we were at Highgate Westhill, with Terry was there, Bante was there, I was there of course, and Val, and we sort of passed the baby round. And I remember Bante for a minute or two bouncing Louise on his knee for a while and then passing her on.
I'd go with him on a couple of occasions to see his mother. I didn't see any difference in his way of relating to her to his way of relating to us. He didn't have that sort of, he didn't take on a persona. And in fact, I think he probably resisted persona and didn't like persona. And I think part of the reason why he moved beyond the persona of being a bhikshu.
The time has come for us to lay aside the masks, painted, hieratic masks. The time has come for us to hang up the gorgeous costumes in the green room cupboard, to leave the brilliantly lit stage, the applause, and to go home through deserted streets to a quiet room, up 3 flights of stairs, and to someone, perhaps, with whom we can be ourselves.
Trungpa Rinpoche had spoken about the dilemma that he felt. The term he used was the golden Buddha on the pedestal.
Our main point is to be able to teach fully with the ordinary Western world. And also there's a general sense of fascination the people's part. And when you talk to them with the robes on, they don't look at you, or they don't listen to you, but they look at your robe.
People just couldn't accept it. I think people found it too threatening. The English people, with their sense of propriety and so forth, may have wanted to have their sort of little pet guru. And at the same time, the Tibetans wanted him to wear his robes and hide behind the Tibetaness as a sort of sense of subtle superiority. So he was completely out there and genuine with who he was, and he was rejected for that.
I had a head at that point full of stories about Hindu yogis and Taoist masters and all of those people. They all had, you know, psychic powers and things. So I kind of assumed that Bhante could probably read my mind. So if you want to spend a really difficult, uncomfortable 2 days, just stay in a small cottage with someone who you think can probably read your every thought. And then occasionally, you know, I'd be thinking, oh, maybe it's time for tea now. And Bhante would say, oh, would you like some tea? And I think, there it is, he knows, he does. Ooh. Yeah. I think gradually I sort of came down to earth in the sense of not being so unrealistic in how I saw spiritual teachers.
Nick Saunders' directories were an essential resource for New Agers.
FWO was one of the mystical groups that I went to. I remember the first class I was at, there were a lot of people drinking tea and talking, and it seemed a wave of warmth and friendliness. There was a talk.
The group pulling in one way, in the direction of conformity, the individual.
I think one or two people fell asleep, but I managed to stay awake. I think it was an hour and a half long, actually, the lecture.
I was quite captivated. I was quite captivated by him, by the practices and where it was leading. And within no time at all, it became the centre of my life.
I mean, I just had nothing else to do. I was looking for something to do with my life, you see. All of us beginners had started up a community. You know, there were arguments and misunderstandings and so on, I think because of the fact that it was a mixed community.
Ratnaguna joined Hridaya, living and working in the movement's flagship men's community, Sukhavati.
Hridaya was my favourite. I was very drawn towards him. He was a very warm, very friendly character.
And that was a rich experience. The place was derelict. We were luckily all young enough to be fit enough to survive. But it was just exciting. And everybody seemed to feel that. And we were sort of feeding off each other, I suppose. There was very little of going out.
This is in the early days of single-sex activities and so on. And I think we were taking it very seriously. I can't think of anyone who was involved in a sexual relationship who was living at Sukhavati.
After 2 years working in Sukhavati, Hridaya was invited to relieve Buddhadasa in Helsinki.
Buddhadasa was there when I started going. That was September 76. Yes, I went on my own and I felt really shy and uncomfortable, but actually then in that group there were quite a few people from the yoga circles and Maitreya himself, so we got on very, very well and remained close till his death 4 years ago. And of course there was also Gunavati, who had just been ordained.
But within a matter of days, I suppose, I too got to know Gunavati, Maitreya and Ula as she was then. And that friendship lasted through those two years.
Yeah, I was happy. I was happy there.
Along with a second child, Abaya's family joined with Sona and Shrimala and their 2 children to form a community in Sulochana's house. She had 5 sons, which presented a conflict of interest.
She was a devoted disciple of Bhante, and also she loved her children. So how to resolve the conflict? It was difficult. And Bhante used to come. He was living in Castleacre with Mark Dunlop. Anyway, we're going to have Buddha Day Festival, and Bhante agreed to come and conduct proceedings. And it was a disaster because Finn and Johnny decided to cause as much trouble as possible. After either meditation or puja, Bhante just sat there for about half an hour in total silence because of what had happened. Doris, Sulochana's mother, sat there. She was about 85. She sat there for the whole that period. And Bhante said to me afterwards, I was quite impressed that Doris managed to stay the course, so to speak. But he said, I shall never do this again. Never. So we didn't see him at Abhirati after that.
When I moved into London, I was very, very fired by the idea of setting up a new society and very attracted towards doing that. And I suppose I saw Amaravati in a way as part of that, really.
The new society is that society, that environment, that social and spiritual context, that context of fellowship with one another, which makes it easier for us to evolve, which helps us to evolve, encourages us to evolve as human beings.
Responding in the FWBO newsletter, Abaya, an ex-Catholic seminarian and family man, named two deeply rooted beliefs that challenged the new society: Christianity and the family.
I come from a family of women in several generations who have been professional women and have had families and careers, and my mother, my grandmother, even a couple of my great-grandmothers worked. So that was how I grew up.
It's common knowledge that I've started a relationship with Vajrapushpa. I want to be with Vajrapushpa, etc. That was stirring people up quite a bit. One or two of the people in Finland must have been writing things to England, to Bhante, putting a very dark slant on my friendship with Vajrapushpa. I returned then to London and feeling a bit sorry for myself, I suppose. I had no money, no job. The friends that I'd had here, even if they weren't hostile, were relating to me in a way that was quite different. Why was I such a threat?
Seminars. I'm not sure that it's obvious, but how much of Bhante's work has been in response to the situation, and especially in those days, especially the earlier seminars, I think there was just such a mutual exploration of things. He would float an idea and then people would come up with various thoughts about it, and then almost inevitably he would then talk for ages, so that the seminar transcript is very very heavy on Bhante's words, but they're all prompted by someone else's question or need to know something or wish to explore something. That's an interesting thing, I think.
Before we start, perhaps I'd better say a few words in explanation of the term Michaditti. Micha means false or wrong or untrue, and ditti means a view, in the sense of opinion as systematically formulated, logically formulated. I came across this in a letter, I'm sorry to say, from an order member. What he stated was that people's relationships, by which he meant sexual relationships, were completely sacrosanct and exempt from criticism. It's just like religion in that nothing that passes under the name of religion should be criticized. Do you see what I mean? This is quite strong with some people, that you have a right to a private life, which no one has any right to examine or question you about, even if there might be an unskillful element in it, etc., because that is your private life. Obviously, you can talk more freely to some people than others. Therefore, talk more freely about everything to some people. But there shouldn't really be a sort of hard and fast division between your public life and your private life. I think this is very crippling for the individual.
Alison Harper was an 18-year-old student at Glasgow School of Art when first she met Sangharakshita. Alison, who later became Leelavati, spent 2 years in India on a scholarship researching representations of femininity. 10 years later, she was working in a cafe next door to Sangharakshita's flat.
And I showed him my work, and again he was really interested. I asked if I could paint him. I was so grateful to have that 3 months of studying him face to face, because then if you know anything about drawing and painting, when you look at something you understand the shapes and where everything fits together quite clearly, then it's easier to improvise. Take a risk, make a mess, make a mistake, and then learn from that. And I think that's, in a sense, getting back to Bhante, that's what I felt. I could be in front of Bhante, I could make mistakes in front of Bhante, and it was all right. And you could take chances, make mistakes, say stupid things, and I felt he held that within a massive personality, a massive being. And I feel eternally grateful for that. I get quite emotional thinking about it. So thank you, Bhante, for that, actually.
When I was his secretary, at one point I asked him in a dream whether Yabyum figures, so these tantric figures, with a figure with a consort, whether they were one figure or two. And in the dream, Bhante kind of pointed at me, and with tremendous amount of energy, he said, they're one figure, and you'll realize that when you're deeply absorbed. And the next thing I knew, I burst into flames and became a sort of tantric deity with this sort of red body and things. But yeah, it just felt as if somehow I was encountering, again, that sort of quality of energy and concentrated energy. Yeah, and it happened to be in the dream state.
Now, integration is necessary, of course, not only at the highest level, at all levels, in all aspects of the spiritual life. And therefore one finds in the Tantras, in Tantric literature, sexual symbolism repeated again and again and again.
It's some funny ideas about women, mind you, so I remember very early on having big tussles about that. And it actually affected my choice of dissertation, which was called Misogyny as an Art Form, exemplified in the work of Edvard Munch. Because some of the ideas I was hearing around women, I came across when looking at the work of Edvard Munch and Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, and so I did my whole dissertation on this aspect of women as a distractor from men's spiritual aspirations, which is interesting. So some of my work in my degree show was about that, actually.
I gather that he was very unhappy about the fact that I hadn't discussed my intention to have a child with him beforehand, and or that neither of us had discussed it with him. And I must say, it wouldn't have even occurred to me to go and talk to him. I didn't, in spite of my sort of respect for him and a lot of positive feelings towards him, I didn't trust him in some respects. And I couldn't see then, and I couldn't see now, why I should have discussed that sort of personal matter with him, knowing what he thought about women.
I was looking for something resembling friendship, I suppose, with him, an affection.
So it was, for some people, a somewhat painful time. But it was an essential part of the process of becoming a true individual. Men had to learn that they didn't have to depend upon women for emotional support and so on. And women had to learn that they didn't have to depend, and in fact shouldn't depend, upon men for emotional support, that they had to look more to themselves. The men seem to have taken the initiative in this respect, so that to begin with there was somewhat more pain and suffering on the part of some of the women. Right? But that's not to say that some of the men subsequently, haven't suffered in this respect.
The movement's 3 C's, centre, community and cooperative, were workplaces for budding bodhisattvas. Aloka's experience in the restaurant team was far from happy.
So I thought, I've had it with the FWBO. So I thought, well, I spent a year thinking about whether or not I was going to resign. All my friends had turned on me. And Vajramati told me quite recently, he said, Padmaraja said to him, well, you mustn't talk to Aloka, you know, he's a very bad influence, you know. I thought I'll just concentrate on the order. I said, I'm no good at any stuff to do with the general public. I'll just concentrate on stuff to do with the order.
I was a neighbour. I lived across the road with my dad and his wife, and I met Aloka and Dharma Mudra and Varaprabha. They were like the interesting neighbours. But in those days he was completely cagey about being a Buddhist because he had left Norwich under a cloud.
Planning for her art school training in London, the young Padma Jyoti dreamt of joining a Buddhist community.
I got told not to set foot in East London. I couldn't actually set foot there. I got told that by a woman in one of the communities. It was really ridiculous. I mean, I was very young and I was having a relationship with a man older than me, you know, but it caused such problems. It was so awful what went on. So that's why I ended up in West London. To my gain, to be fair. I mean, it was wonderful. And Paramananda was running it, and he was an absolute genius. I found out a lot in terms of literature, in terms of art, Bhante, the Dharma. I think that was more important than the art school, actually.
I tell him about boyfriends and my relationships and all that, you know, about this when I was a bit younger, and complain about them when he goes, really, and what did you say then? And I said, we said this. What do you think, Bhante? Well, yeah. So I was quite astonished at how pragmatic he was in response to my, I'm thinking of getting married and other people say I shouldn't. And so rather than saying, no, that's a bad idea, he asked me about Andrew, my husband, and what does he do? And I said, he's a lawyer. And he said, oh, very lucrative. He said, you could have a big studio. He could support you in a style to which you've not yet become accustomed. I remember these are the words. And I always felt he was able to see me and I'm sure other people as an individual. And so on the one hand, the movement's sort of advocating sort of general principles and guidelines for living. At the same time, he is able to respond to you as an individual. What do you need and what are you interested in? How are you going to go about aspects of your life? And when we got back from Kenya, he took us out for a curry. When my son was born, he picked lavender from the garden and sent it to us. So I just always felt that he was just very warm and accepting and it seemed unconditional, just interested, really interested. Yeah.
My personal history as a mitra was horrendous. I mean, it took me, I think it was nearly 14 years to get ordained. And I did all the retreats going under the sun, and it was ridiculous, really. You know, I'd go and talk to him about all this stuff that was going on. I mean, I think he was absolutely horrified. But he wasn't very good at doing anything about it, and I sometimes struggled with him in that sense. Do you tell people to stop doing certain things, or don't you? Or do you see what I mean?
And I felt like he was always relating in a way almost on that dual level. Yes, he had to relate to the person in front of him now, but I thought he was always relating to their potential, and I think that's why he managed to take a whole lot of really raw recruits to the Dharma, you know, most of us pretty young, hardly any Dharma experience, and somehow give us the confidence to go out there and give talks and start centres and lead meditation classes and be Kalyana Mitras, spiritual friends to people, and start right livelihood businesses. I think it was extraordinary. Well, in one way, I think it was mad. You know, if I think about myself, you know, I was sort of taken into the order after only a very short time really of being in contact with the Dharma, and thrown in the deep end, giving talks and leading meditation classes within a few months of ordination. And when I look back now, I really didn't know very much, but hopefully I did more good than harm. And it's, Bhante had to work with what he'd got, and if he wanted to build a Buddhist movement, well then, he had to put these raw recruits in the front line. He couldn't do it all himself.
We're here, our generation, we're here to make all the most obvious mistakes. That is inevitably, historically, what we are here for. So that people who come along later will say, oh, well, they tried that wasn't so good, but if it keeps going, there's no guarantee, but if it keeps going, and people will learn from our mistakes.
I remember Bhante being completely relaxed, and he lay down on a bench on this rather old-fashioned ferry, and just lay there snoozing. Something about his complete naturalness, instead of the rather formal Bhante that I was used to.
Asvajita Nakshobhya had set up this private shrine, ordination shrine, underneath a sycamore tree on the banks of the river, and I thought this was marvellous. I just loved it. I arrived at my private ordination shrine and this hedgehog came snuffling through. The next day I was telling Bhante that it wasn't a very private ordination because this hedgehog had been witness to it, and he said, "Oh, you didn't see the opossum behind you?" He said it came up, stared at the candle lights and stayed there for quite a few minutes while you were reciting the refuges and precepts. So I thought I'd been thoroughly witnessed.
He takes people seriously, meets them very fully, and I think this is something that you do see when he meets people one-to-one.
I rather liked that, to be taken seriously when I was a very young person, because definitely nobody else did, but he did.
Thank you, I'm fine. Very glad we can meet again.
It's quite obvious when people come out after meeting Bhante, they'll say to you, "Can I have a hug?" You'll see the tears starting up in their eyes, and there's something happened. Very positive.
I felt like I was part of setting up the conditions, because people would often turn up very sort of a bit anxious. They were going to meet Bhante Sangharakshita, and so I'd be trying to sort of start off setting them at ease a little bit and making them tea and talking to them. And then often they'd be telling me a little bit about what they'd come to see Bhante about. And sometimes they'd have some issue which was really on their minds, and they were concerned and they couldn't work out what to do about it, and it was really bothering them. And so I'd then take them in to see Bhante, and they'd be with him for half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour, however long it was. And they'd come out looking much happier, really bright. And as I was seeing them out, I'd say, "Well, did you talk to Bhante about this issue that was bothering you?" And in some cases, they'd go, "No, I didn't. No, I never mentioned it." And it seemed so strange, because that had been, what was filling their mind before they walked in, and they hadn't even raised it. And it wasn't nervousness or anything. It was just that in Bhante's presence, Bhante being very relaxed, very easy, and you could feel this, you were in this sort of field of metta and awareness. In that situation, it was as if their problem, whatever it was, had just fallen away. So it just didn't arise. And they'd come out, in a really different state of mind, never having asked.
Bhante is absolutely extraordinary. He's just the weirdest person I'd ever met, which was impressive, because I'd met a fair number of what I'd call weird people.
Going by way of Amen Corner to get to Tooting Library, Dennis Lingwood, 16, had a mystical experience.
As I crossed from one side of the street to the other, I suddenly awoke to the complete absurdity of the mind being tied down to a single physical body. Why could I not look at the world through the eyes of the man standing on the opposite pavement? Why could I not know his thoughts as easily as I knew my own? When, years later, I read in the Surangama Sutra the dialogue in which the Buddha makes his disciple Ananda realize, step by step, that his consciousness is neither inside the body, nor outside it, nor yet somewhere between, being in its true nature universal, I felt I was treading on familiar ground.
He's a guide in the realm of myth. It's like everyone's in their own little myth, like being an island on a sea, but he's capable of sailing around the entire ocean and connecting all these islands up. So, a psychopomp is a guide for the dead. So a mythophanic is like a guide through myth. So it's a journey that you do, but most people don't have access to that stuff, or very little access. Whereas Bhante is the world he lives in, and he can connect people up through that. You can call it Buddhism if you like, but I mean, to me it's something much bigger than just Buddhism in its, Victorian heritage.
According to Aloka, Sangharakshita would open a riding school if it was a way to communicate the Dharma.
Why did I say Julius Caesar? Why did I say that Julius Caesar resembled the Buddha more than any other historical character? Well, it was because of his promptitude and courage. If Caesar saw that something was to be done, I'm not speaking now whether it was ethically right or wrong, if he saw that there was something to be done, he did it.
This question comes from Eddie. Why has power, authority and callous indifference crept, at times, into Sukhavati community and the LBC in general? Well, there's a very general point to be made here. That is to say, within the movement, within the order even, there are not many stream entrants. If you are a stream entrant, you'll be operating predominantly in accordance with the love mode. But if you are not a stream entrant, you'll be operating predominantly in accordance with the power mode.
He really abided by the principle of operating out of the love mode rather than the power mode. So, for instance, there was a point where at one of our centres there was somebody who we wanted to invite on the men's ordination course in Tuscany. And this person had been working in Right Livelihood there, and so we asked the centre if they would support him to go off to Tuscany for the course. But the people at the centre felt that this person wasn't really ready for ordination. They had doubtful about it. They didn't really want him to go, so they said they wouldn't do it. So Bhante then got me to write a letter to the centre explaining all the reasons why he felt it would be a good idea if they did this, and I sent it off. And the centre council who ran the centre, they had a meeting and decided that they were absolutely right and they weren't going to do it. And at that point I was getting up in arms thinking, well, Bhante's their teacher and I know this person, I agree, I really think they should be on the ordination course, and I can't understand why this centre council aren't agreeing. And I kind of wanted Bhante to go, well, I started all this, so you can do what I say now, thank you. I've considered your views. But he just wouldn't. He said, no, if I do that, I won't be treating them as order members. I won't be treating them as Dharma practitioners. I'll be using power. I'll be using my authority in that way. So he just didn't. But at the same time, he found another way of making sure that this person did find the finances to get out to Tuscany. So there were instances like that where, just watching how he lived day after day, that was really the teaching for me.
There were no ordinations in 70 or 71. Then, in 1972, Sangharakshita ordained 7 men and 1 woman, bringing order numbers up to 17.
When I joined the Friends, I guess I was suffering. And I was looking for a way of dealing with my problems. There are lots of unexpressed things in my life, in my nature. Unborn things, which are now being born, which are growing. I have a much bigger or more adequate self-experience now, experience of myself. I feel alive, I'm growing.
In 1978, Sangharakshita appointed Padmaraja chairman of FWBO Surrey.
When I was leaving and handing the chair over to him, he'd been on a solitary retreat and he was quite scared. And he was quite scared of the responsibility.
Having completed a decade in office, I feel that now is a good time to pause for a moment and look back. 10 years ago, in my first annual report to the Council as chairman, I presented 5 objectives for the development of FWBO Surrey.
By focusing on a homegrown order Mitra Sangha, conditions were set for an unhealthy group dynamic.
Well, I said to Subhuti very early on, look, something's happening in Croydon and I'm worried because I don't think it's just neurotic, I think it's psychotic. People showed up for a beginner's class and you'd see him, he'd be saying, oh, really, man? He had a way of kind of meeting, so tell me more. So, oh, you do that, do you? What's brought you here? He had a way of talking to people in a way that met them in a way they probably had never been met before. He wasn't trying to get people so he could manipulate them, but the outcome of that, when he had the power of the chair, because, well, it doesn't usually come with power, but in his case it came with power because of the world he was creating and the power he had to include or exclude people.
Well, Padmaraja was always sort of like on his guard. I remember this film from Drinking a Cup of Tea on one of the very, very early films. He was always very sort of conscious of projecting a sort of image or a sort of position. And there was this sort of feeling that he could read your mind. His consciousness seemed to be picking up in some way with other people's consciousness, whatever. But Padmaraja wanted to make it into a thing that he did. And of course, we were all 20-something-year-olds and we wanted someone who was remarkable and special and all the rest of it. And of course, he'd always talk about Bhante.
I think he luxuriated really in Bhante's approval of what was happening in Croydon. Bhante would make these comparisons between Croydon and the London Buddhist Centre. Croydon was this, smart naval procession, and the London Buddhist Centre was this kind of wild sort of world of pirates. And Padmaraja loved that. He thought that Bhante was okay, but that he'd been completely misinformed by Subhuti. That Bhante didn't really understand Croydon, that Bhante as a teacher was generally being compromised by his reliance on Subhuti. That was Padmaraja's take on the situation.
Padmaraja and his young followers were in a symbiotic relationship. He gave them a feeling that they were at the cutting edge of the FWBO, the creme de la creme of the order, while they gave him the uncritical loyalty that supported his style of leadership.
At this point, someone said, Padmaraja can recognise your energy, Mike. Of course, I immediately knew what he was referring to. Yes, the time in the kitchen when my hysterical energies had woken Padmaraja up, thus demonstrating that I needed to run every day if I wasn't to start going mad and talking about poetry, Rilke, and all that deluded egotistical stuff.
It wasn't just subtle psychological bullying. It was like downright screaming at people. Horrible, horrible stuff.
For some minor mistake, there was some deep psychological reason why you had done it. I mean, someone should have stood up and said, this is a load of bollocks, frankly. But we didn't.
On Sangharakshita's 60th birthday, 2 fundraising drives enabled the complete purchase of Padmaloka and the purchase of a farm on the Welsh borders, which became Taraloka, a retreat centre for women.
Seeing people's individual mandalas and then seeing them all hung together on the outside of our big marquee, they look really beautiful and definitely give you a sense of that dual effect of all these different friendships.
This new feature offers a comfortable and safe environment within the meditative atmosphere of Tara's realm.
Taraloka and Tiratnaloka are still the only 2 substantial women's retreat centres for women run by women. Other Buddhist groups don't have those sorts of facilities.
It so happened that I was due to visit India and was expecting to conduct ordinations there. However, my mother asked me not to go, and I was happy to do what she wanted, for she was ill at the time and may have been afraid of dying while I was away. I therefore asked Subhuti, Kamalashila and Padmaraja to go in my stead and to conduct the ordinations on my behalf. I invited Padmaraja in the hope of getting him away from Croydon and into a working relationship with other senior order members. He declined my invitation on the grounds that he was agoraphobic and unable to function outside the circle of his friends. I therefore asked Suvajra to take Padmaraja's place, and off the 3 of them went to India.
I was on a meditation retreat, and somebody said, "Oh, Shamala wants you on the phone." He said to me, "Oh, Bhante wants you to go to India to ordain 2 people, and I shall be with you, and Padmashuri will be the other one, and you'll be doing public. Well, do you want to do it?" And I said, "Well, give me a few days."
Generally, a dozen witnesses attend a public ordination. Not so in India.
And there probably were about 500. I think I was nervous, but I did it. Yeah.
Sangharakshita arrived in Spain to spend winter in his mountain chalet. To kick-start local interest, he gave a number of talks and interviews.
El estudio del Dharma nos ayuda a conocernos a nosotros mismos.
So I don't think it is possible to know yourself completely first and then take up some spiritual path.
Unfortunately, his visit was cut short by illness, and he returned to England.
I was in hospital awaiting a prostatectomy, and I invited various senior order members to stay at Padmaloka and to visit me, as I thought I might not survive the operation. One of those invited was Padmaraja. I had invited him because I suspected that in his heart of hearts he was moving away from me and the movement, and I hoped that a demonstration of affection and confidence on my part would help reverse the process.
When the Croydon Men's Mitra convener went to India, Sangharakshita appointed Manjunatha to take his place.
Padmaraja had more than once asked me to replace Manjunatha as Men's Mitra convener, on the grounds that he was a divisive influence, but I'd refused to do so. I found Manjunatha a useful source of information about what was happening at the Croydon Centre.
So I couldn't sleep, and maybe 40 minutes, an hour later, somebody gets up, naked, and he goes out. I'm thinking, so is there somebody still in the bed? And of course there was. So they've been together in bed, comforting each other.
Yeah.
He started talking to the Mitras in Croydon very sensibly, didn't go to the order members. They were delighted, and of course it started bubbling up. Once he'd let the genie out of the bottle, it had its own momentum.
One morning I received a letter with some disturbing news. The letter was from Manjunatha, the Men's Mitra convener of the Croydon Buddhist Centre, and it informed me that 2 male Mitras connected with the Croydon Centre had complained to him that they were being bullied by some of the male order members there. I replied at once, telling Manjunatha that he should ask the 2 Mitras to write to me direct, and I would take up the matter with Padmaraja, the chairman of the centre, asking for his comments.
A lot of very experienced order members were very critical of the situation as it had developed in Croydon.
So Vajra had written a report and it hadn't yet been published. And Padmaraja was still assuming that report would clear him.
So I asked to go and see him down in Croydon. I was advised by some of my friends not to do that, but I thought, no, I will go down and I will talk to him. And I did, and I said to him, look, this is what people are saying about you. And initially he dismissed it. The usual story from his point of view, people are jealous of us, they don't understand, and so on. I said, no, these are very experienced order members. They're not involved in something else that would make them jealous of your situation. These are genuine kind of peer criticisms, and you need to know that they're there. But we had the conversation, but clearly he didn't take the point.
Aryatara has developed into one of the largest and strongest communities in the movement. There have been two main factors in its success. The first of these was the establishment of the cooperative. The second major factor in Aryatara's strength has been the establishment of the single-sex principle, which enabled the community to rise onto a new level, becoming much stronger and more concentrated.
They were just fireproof. They couldn't see the problem.
I'd seen him in another situation where, when he couldn't get his way, he just washed his hands of things. So I wasn't completely surprised, but it was very dramatic.
To my utter astonishment, Padmaraja wrote resigning as chairman of the Croydon Buddhist Centre and as a member of the Western Buddhist Order. He gave no reasons for his resigning, though I remember hearing that friends had tried to persuade him not to do so, but that he was adamant. A week or more after receiving Padmaraja's letter of resignation, I left Guhyaloka for England. On my arrival at Padmaloka, I asked all the Croydon male order members to come and see me, and at a meeting in the lounge, I gave them a very severe dressing down for the way some of them had treated the mitras.
That particular chapter meeting that we attended with Bhante, he was banging on the arm of his chair and he said, Padmaraja is paranoid and any of you that go along with him are not his friends.
He pulls out this letter from a mitra, about being bullied and, just chokes his way, through these, I never set up a movement so people could create dictatorships, but he could hardly get the words out.
Mitras were to be befriended, I declared, not bullied. True, the bullying had been mainly verbal, with a little pushing and shoving, but I was not prepared to tolerate even the slightest bullying of mitras, whether at Croydon or anywhere else in the movement. By the time I had finished, they looked thoroughly ashamed and had very little to say for themselves.
It was a direct intervention by Bhante, was the only thing that brought that to an end. There really was a danger, just given how absolutely homogeneous the atmosphere in Croydon was. If he got his timing wrong, they would leave the movement, the whole centre.
It was a very difficult time. And we'd sort of lost our reason for being there, Padmaraja's sort of vision, and the art centre disappeared as well. I remember Bhante writing to me once when I was speculating we might open another restaurant. He said, yes, I think sometimes you're too success-orientated. I got a letter from Sona saying, me and Subhuti have been talking about you and wondering what you're going to do next. We wondered if you might like to come to Padmaloka. I was mainly the cook there. So I got bored and I started getting this urge to go back to Croydon. I think I went all guns blazing. I wanted to develop a bit more ambition for the restaurant, etc., etc. I stopped functioning as a sort of social being during that time. I stopped being able to identify myself and my whole relationship to the movement changed, and I was having visions of things that were giving me information that I thought came from almost like, as it were, outside of me. as if it didn't come from inside me. Subhuti was a very close friend. I sometimes write to him 3 times a week, and he said, "Oh yeah, I'm just reading through your letters. It's really, really interesting, Sangharakshita. I'm really enjoying witnessing your process."
Now, 29 years after my receiving that disturbing news from Manjunatha, the Croydon Buddhist Centre is flourishing. The mitras there are happy, and while writing this account, I received from a group of men mitras there, as an expression of their love and respect, a card and a bouquet.
Bhante was president of centres, but it had become completely nominal, really. After Croydon, the idea came up that there should be at least one senior order member who, as it were, befriended that centre and make friendly criticism and advice where necessary. And then I think, you know, that then tied into the idea that Bhante was passing on the public precepting and eventually passing on being head of the order, so there needed to be a body of senior order members who would kind of guide the movement.
When the retreats, the Going for Refuge retreat started at Pamaloka, I mean, that was a massive leap forward. You know, that there was a language for talking about all this stuff, you know. I mean, I didn't go through an ordination process. There was no such thing. You know, I just was around for a bit, you know, and I seemed to be going to be around more.
There is no doubt that the new style men's ordination process at Pamaloka is one of the most positive developments to have taken place in the course of the last 2 years, and one whose repercussions have already been felt throughout the movement in Europe, and perhaps even further afield.
With mindfulness, strive on.
The most important development during the last 2 years, however, has been my handing over responsibility for conferring the Dharmachari ordination to Subhuti and Subhadra. As Subhuti reported in,
Subhuti used this particular expression: "In witnessing another's going for refuge, my own is called into question." And Bhante obviously loved this.
"In witnessing someone else's going for refuge, my own is called into question, both by myself and by others. For it is the whole order which, indirectly if not directly, witnesses the ordinees going for refuge, and therefore the whole order whose going for refuge is ultimately called into question."
This is an issue not just for preceptors, it's an issue for every single order member. You know, in principle, every order member is witnessing the going for refuge of someone.
Bhante had expressed a wish to hand his responsibilities over for the ordination process. That had already happened to a large extent in the men's wing, and he wanted that process to be well underway in the women's wing as well.
What it really helps is, for me, I'm really there. I feel that all of myself is there, and I think that probably helps to deepen my practice, the fact that I'm really there at that person's ordination.
I felt totally accepted by Ratnashuri. You know, the most important moment in my life, she was there just imbuing kindness and metta, really. So I remember that very, very strongly.
It really helps that you've got to really practice harder. If you're a preceptor, you can't just let things go slide. You can't. If you have a tendency that way, then you can't do it.
By its nature, you have to go beyond having a personal identity bound up with it, because otherwise that's going to get in the way of you engaging with people on that level and really being there for them.
I love having the opportunity to say, here it is, we've done it, we've got it, because it's a marvellous book.
The mountains and the snows were a permanent part of my life in Kalimpong. And I think I can say that my life there was very much intertwined, one might even say, with the life of the mountains.
I mean, he took me for a walk around Surling. He said he was feeling very unsupported by the order. It was one of those periods where people start criticising him. Comes around about once every 10 years, I think. Because I remember I stopped him in the middle of the street and said, look, you know, you may be feeling unsupported, but look, you've saved my life. I said, I'm totally with you. Whatever you want, I'll do. He just went, carried on walking.
He decided that he would like a change of scenery. He thought about moving down to London and asked me whether I'd like to come. And that's how we ended up in a rather small flat adjacent to Sangharakshita, poky little place. I got the sense that he was very, very much at home in London. He loved the anonymity of it, you know, just getting out by himself, or sometimes I'd go with him. You know, we went to lots of plays. I suppose in a sense we bonded very strongly at that period. Yeah, a little overwhelming for me, of course, Bhante being Bhante. And me being relatively, I think, unintegrated at that time. I think I was connecting with myself in ways that would serve me well eventually.
January, and Bhante returns to India, accompanied by Paramartha.
Interest in Buddhism exploded all over India during Dr. Ambedkar's centenary year.
But we couldn't go all over India, so we developed this training scheme for people from different parts of India, young people, to come for 8 months for our residential training course, so that they'd at least go back with the rudiments of Buddhism and some definite, tangible experience. They engage with people from different parts of India, different scheduled caste, different scheduled tribe backgrounds, and so on, where the Dharma became more important than their background. So it was a sort of unifying experience.
Lokomotor tells me this is, in effect, a going for refuge community. And I hope that sooner or later every single one of you will effectively go for refuge. And I cannot give you a better hope or a bigger blessing than that.
जो बाबा साहब का ये सपना था कि सभी दोषी ने बुद्धिज्म का फैलाव करना चाहिए, हर समय होते रहना चाहिए, ताकि नौजवानों में भी के साथ भी मैत्री का व्यवहार कर सकें।
जो हम सिचुएशन में उससे उबार सकता है, तो हम कह सकते हैं ये धर्म ही पूरी दुनिया पे होना चाहिए, फैलना चाहिए, तभी हम मतलब आगे जा सकते हैं और अपने आप को कुछ देख सकते हैं।
भंते से बाबा साहब की जो 3 मुलाकातें हुई, कुछ सालों बाद ही भंते ने बाबा साहब का जो सपना है वो सच कर दिए, वो सारी दृष्टि फैलते गई।
Well, the Buddha in the White Lotus Sutra says that there are not 3 distinct spiritual ideals for people of 3 different spiritual capacities. There is ultimately only one spiritual path, and the other 3 paths all merge into this one path.
This retreat is it's an ordination retreat. This is the first point about it. Lal is going to be ordained. He's going to receive his private ordination on Thursday evening, and then his public ordination on Sunday morning.
Do you think that the movement in the States is kind of now analogous to the early days of the movement in England?
Oh no, you're all much too respectable. I sometimes say in England, my one fear is that in England the movement will become too respectable. And in the very early days I used to say that the effort of Christmas Humphreys was to make British Buddhism respectable. And I used to say, well, the function of Sangharakshita is to make it unrespectable. But
it would be challenging, but it wouldn't be putting you down at the same time. Whereas other people, sometimes you can feel challenged, but there's a put down. So I do think he's a disruptor and maybe iconoclast is another word for that. People need that, don't you? Don't we in a sense, a society needs it and individuals need it.
Take the second story. I started the Health Center project the same time that I got involved with the FWBO. I really credit, in a way, the FWBO for the Health Center being able to be in existence, because I just developed confidence to be able to do this, to really go for it, and to learn how to have a vision and to act in accordance with that vision, and yet keep it flexible enough so that you could actually accomplish something. The teenagers who come to the center, most of them don't have any medical insurance. They come from low-income families. Many of them are new to the country. Many of them haven't seen a doctor in years.
traditionally, it's when the kesa is placed around your neck that you are at last, fully and finally, with body, speech and mind, ordained. There we are. Good.
A lot of the time he was just sitting day after day after day, which is very impressive, writing beautiful, timeless atmospheres in the flats where he's obviously in very deep concentration. So partaking in that was quite something.
The Rainbow Road, which I show you now.
When I first met Bhante, I was very, very shy. And I said to him, I'm very shy with you. And he said, oh, well, what's it like? Is it like meeting your headmaster? And I said, oh, no, it's not like that at all, no. And I couldn't think of how it was. But after I left, after I went out of his study, I realised, no, it's actually more like meeting royalty. That you know a lot about them, but they don't know anything about you. They haven't met you. It's a sort of unequal relationship.
After 4 years in London, Sangharakshita set off with Paramartha for a 7-month tour of the US, Australia and New Zealand. Chanting the White Tara mantra wishes a long life for the Guru.
Shanti.